I'm Frank Vaughn. It's July 24th, 2025, and there are days I don't even know where to begin, so let's just begin somewhere. It should come as no surprise to anybody that Canada has a long history of doing extrajudicial punishment without even a law on the books to explain it, and here's another example of it. We would think of this in past tense because there were people who were debanked and prevented from functioning in society, which debanking shouldn't even be a thing. Unless you walk into a branch and you start throwing chairs around, yelling at people all the time, you might be encouraged to move across the road to a different branch. But since you need a bank account to function, there is no way to function in society independent of a bank account. This idea that people can just be arbitrarily kicked out of banking institutions because of their political views is really totalitarian. Should worry everybody. And it's not a past tense thing. It happened in the past, but it's still ongoing. This is Eva Chipiuk, who made herself famous by cross-examining the Prime Minister during the Emergencies Act inquiry farce that we did in this country, which actually found that the government was completely wrong in invoking the Emergencies Act against the Freedom Convoy. But this isn't past tense. This is July 23rd. RBC issued her a notice saying, "You're done. You don't get to bank with us anymore." She didn't commit a crime. She didn't do anything against RBC's terms in terms of repayments or being behind on payments or doing anything wrong. She is simply being targeted for her politics by a bank, and she has to move across the road. And luckily, there was a small town credit union there to take her business, which is where you should probably go with your business. Get away from these people, these politically captured ideologists. Canada is such a corrupt one-party state. It really is the uniparty. The Conservatives try to maybe break the balance of power, but when it comes to Ontario and Quebec, there's only one group of people running the show, and since they run Ottawa, they run the country. And before I continue along this theme, I just have to say, what is with Scott Moe? What is with Daniel Smith? Why do Western premiers constantly make the mistake of trying to save their people and save their provinces within the context of the Federation? Nobody's thinking outside the box here. And it's stuff like this picture that is really concerning. Doug Ford is a liberal. He actively campaigned against the Conservative Party of Canada, which Scott Moe and Daniel Smith all but endorsed. Doug Ford wouldn't even meet with Poilievre. Why? Because Poilievre gave Roman Baber a job after Doug Ford kicked him out of caucus because this guy's a commie. Like his brother said, he's a pinko. But here's Scott Moe and Daniel Smith willing to stand beside him. They're setting up a situation where we're going to get screwed again. Ottawa's got a bunch of empty promises and a bunch of empty rhetoric, and for some reason, no one's thinking outside the box. And the box is this federation. The box is what's holding us down. We got to start thinking bigger. This is the guy the Western premiers are cozying up with. He's very humble, Ford says. Carney stayed at his Muskoka cottage on Monday night. Remember the photo opportunity where Doug Ford hugged Mark Carney, but they hid the picture because it would be bad optics, so they just showed the handshake? And they sat in a cafe meeting each other when Doug Ford wouldn't even acknowledge Pierre Poilievre's existence. In the midst of an election campaign, this is who they're aligning with. Here he is, standing beside the other guy, the leader of Quebec. Quebec, who has held this country back. Quebec, who has held Western Canada back. Why are our premiers wasting their time talking to the people who have spent decades holding us down? This isn't thinking outside the box. This is a bunch of virtue signaling. With Bill C-5 now becoming law, the Western provinces have lost even more power. And what is this nation? What is this system that the premiers seem unendingly and unerringly dedicated to? It's a Canada that approves entry for more than 17,600 people with a criminal record in the last decade. That is people who already had records, not those who created records once they got here. That number is far higher. A Canada that has 1.6 million individuals with disabilities who are new immigrants. So they come in, they wait for their waiting period, and they can qualify for our generous welfare system, and they've never paid a dollar into it. 1.6 million of them. Isn't that fantastic? This Canada, and interesting, just keep this in mind. The Canada Immigration Act requires Canada to reject applications for immigration from persons with any disease, disorder, disability, or other health impairment which may cause them to be a danger to public health or public safety, or which may reasonably be expected to place excessive demands on health or the social system. This is why I say to you over and over again, Canada is a lawless nation. The rule of law is gone from here. We don't have it anymore. It's not just the selective application of the law, and we're going to get into more of that with a high-profile trial that's going on right now. It's that laws like this, fundamental to the underpinnings of what Canada is, our very Immigration Act, are completely ignored in the pursuit of mass immigration. We're just letting everybody in, even though it contravenes the law, and nothing is getting done about it. And none of the premiers who are gathered together talking about how to save the Federation and preserve it, make it stronger, talking about interprovincial trade, they're basically dickering with pennies, okay? We can't replace the United States. Interprovincial trade cannot replace the United States. The European Union cannot replace the United States. We have to get along with the United States. We have destroyed our relationship because of the Orange Man in the public mind with the best relationship any nation's ever enjoyed with another partner, the largest economy in the world. And we are constantly flipping the bird to them. Even this elbows up fraud, the people are still running with it. The lemmings who voted for the Liberal Party are still out there pretending elbows up. Meanwhile, it's been elbows down since Mark Carney won. They've been on vacation. They haven't been doing anything because the emergency they sold to the voter has passed, and it doesn't matter. The voter is still down for it because this country is dominated by a total lack of self-awareness. It's like I said in yesterday's video. We have the biggest chip on our shoulder that's ever been carried by an inferiority complex. We don't even know who we are. Now, I don't know who could think that the failure to apply the wording and the law, the letter of the law of the Immigration Act, isn't a big deal. Probably everybody watching this thinks that's a big deal in one way or another. And I don't know how anybody watching could think that the government suspending the charter rights of thousands of people, let alone the millions that those thousands represented when the convoy went to Ottawa, because millions of people were being actively discriminated against and having their right to bodily autonomy violated, forced into starvation, forced into debt, forced to make a choice between eating and keeping the bills and the lights on and taking part in a medical experiment which had disastrous repercussions for thousands of people. And the entire media complex in this country has moved on. I don't think anybody watching this fails to see the problem, but it's even worse than that, because even at a basic level, when it comes to violent crime, we don't have justice in this country. The headline has just stopped jailing criminals, the absurd odyssey of Canada's catch and release justice system in the past decade, identity-based justice, which means if you come from an ethnic background where your skin pigment happens to be more prevalent than somebody with less skin pigment, you're entitled to a lighter sentence or no sentence at all because of white privilege. It's an inversion, because the only people anymore who are actively discriminated against by the government are people who are called white with less skin pigment. Discriminated against when it comes to employment opportunity, discriminated against by the law. The book gets thrown at people with less skin pigment or people who err politically, but it doesn't get thrown at people who stab and murder and rob and various other crimes. 2 days after Christmas in 2022, OPP Constable Greg Percella pulled up on a vehicle in a ditch near Brantford, Ontario. Percella knew nothing about the car or its occupants and was presumably pulling over to offer assistance. He was fatally shot in an ambush-style attack within moments of exiting his vehicle. Percella was among 8. We have advertising we have to deal with. It doesn't matter. I know the story. Percella was among 8 officers that were killed in that year. And a lot of those fatalities were by people who should have been in jail. Everybody should remember this example of what justice looks like in Canada. Omar Ahmad Said Khadr is a Canadian who, at the age of 15, was detained by the United States at Guantanamo Bay for 10 years, during which he pled guilty to the murder of U.S. Army Sergeant First Class Christopher Spear and other charges. He was charged 5 times for war crimes under the Military Commissions Act of 2006, including murder in violation of the laws of war. Cotter identified Canada as a soft target in his legal pursuit, and he sued the Canadian government for infringing his rights on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and this lawsuit was settled in 2017 with a $10.5 million payment and an apology by the federal government. The man was a convicted war criminal. The government apologized and paid him enough money that he can live a comfortable life forever. Meanwhile, the backdrop, Crown to respond at sentencing hearing for Freedom Convoy leaders Litch Barber. First off, Freedom Convoy, in the quotes, still drives me nuts to this day. It's the Freedom Convoy. That's what it was. You capitalized it. Why do you got to put it in quotes like that? You don't do it for other causes. You don't do it for BLM. You don't do it for all these radicals, these Palestinians, all these people. You just do it for this one thing. And how many people have been charged and convicted for the destruction of property well in excess of what happened at the Freedom Convoy and all these protests against Israel going on all around the country? Now, I highlight that because I don't see Jewish Canadians out there destroying property in the pursuit of their interests, in their limited pursuit of their interests, because they are not gathering in the streets every single day. They're not smashing the windows out of our universities. They're not doing any of that. But these people are. There's no justice for them. There's no big write-up. But these people are about to be sentenced. I don't expect a lenient sentence at all. I expect the Crown is probably going to get close to what it's asking for, which is 7 years for Litch and 8 years for Barber. And they've been found guilty of counseling others to disobey a court order. Now, remember what counseling is. It's where they told the truckers to stay put during their protest. A protest that was broken up under the Emergencies Act by a government that was found to be wrong, completely wrong in the execution of the Emergencies Act. These people said words. That's all they did. They said words and they made social media posts. And they're being dragged through the ringer for it, whether you like them or not. I know there is some dispute out there, people asking where the money went, all these different questions. Set it all aside for a minute and just compare how the law applies differently depending on the politics of the individuals being targeted by the law. Here's another example. Lesser-known controversial so-called street preachers using the term so-called. That's what they are. They're street preachers. But you have to put so-called in there because it taints the headline, because it's not news. It's about creating an impression. Charged with hate crimes in British Columbia after years of complaints in Ontario, Stephen Ravbar, Matthew Carapella have resurfaced in BC. Now, these guys, according to court documents obtained by CBC News, they are accused of mischief motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression for a pair of incidents dating back to a Sunday in November 2024, for assailing women with comments on how they should behave and dress. Okay, now you can disagree with this approach. See, if you understand the laws that actually apply in Canada and how they apply, remember, it's all about ideology, then you should give some thought about how you represent yourself on the street. An example of somebody who does it really well is Billboard Chris. He does it very effectively, and he avoids legal liability because of the way that he does it. These guys are incurring liability because of their approach, not because of their beliefs. But what I want to highlight, I'm not trying to justify their actions, but what I want to highlight is that CBC has column inches. And they've had column inches for these two several times as time goes by. But there are faiths in this country that believe women should dress in cloth sacks and cover all but their eyes. And CBC never talks about that. That is the height of misogyny. Certain belief systems see women as property, merely an extension of men. And they're allowed into the country. Their ideologies are not discussed. Their religions are protected. They're allowed to live their lives without any examination by the CBC. Surely, these men and their words have caused far less harm to women than an ideology that views them inside of the requirement of living their lives in a cloth sack as the property of a man. I remember one time I ran into one of these apparitions. It was in Brighton, Ontario. I was at the No Frills there, and I was coming up in the lineup. And I was a fair ways back in the line. And this dude, I actually watched him come in the store, and I kept running into them in the aisles. There was this man with this woman dressed in a cloth sack. He made her push the cart. He made her fill the cart. He pointed to stuff on the shelves, and she put the stuff in the cart. He made her push the full cart up to the till. He made her unload the cart. He made her bag all the groceries. He made her put them in the cart, and he made her push them out to the car and then unload those groceries. The entire time, he did nothing. Nothing. He just paid. He was a young man, younger than I was. And this woman kept her eyes down, staring at the floor. And everybody in that No Frills noticed it happening. You could see it. But what you could also see on most faces was denial. I kept trying to make eye contact with the guy. Like I was staring a hole right through his head. He did everything he could to avoid looking me in the eyes. Because if we had made eye contact, maybe there would have been some words. There would have been an exchange. I stared at him. I tried to stare a hole right through the side of his head. That's what we should be doing. But CBC doesn't have time for that story, that reality. Brighton, Ontario, small town Brighton, Ontario. It's everywhere. Another story from CBC. This goes along with the white nationalist story they did the other day. They got all kinds of resources for this stuff, but they don't have resources for all the other things I'm highlighting for you. They don't tell you the full story. They don't go digging if it's politically inconvenient. They only go digging when it serves the political ideology that emanates from Ottawa. That's what it is. It's state media. It's a state broadcaster. It might as well be Pravda, but Canadian Pravda. CBC investigation finds some big grocers promoting imported food with Canadian branding. You know something? This is an old problem. This has been going on for a long time. I'm not sure CBC has cared about this in the past. They may have. I know I cared about it when I was running farmers markets and representing people who actually sold their locally grown produce that weren't cheating. And you know what this kind of fakery at the grocery stores led to? The regulation of us. So as small producers, farming on 2, 3, 5 acres and going to the market garden with all our fruits and vegetables, we had strict, stringent signage requirements. We had to label every single product individually, saying that it was grown in Ontario, what it was, with a price. We had all these regulations, and we had sign cops, which were generally students, who were given very nice brand new cars by the government to just drive around and harass people at farmers markets over their signs, threatening fines and confiscation. The other thing we dealt with, in the wake of Maple Leaf Foods killing a bunch of people in one of their plants through neglect of sanitation standards and all, like there was this huge hoopla. What came out of that was regulation of farmers markets. And we had to fight tooth and nail because they were going to put a lot of people out of business. And we had to say, can you find an example of a time when we killed anybody, when we poisoned anybody? Like, can you find a concrete example of a farmer's market actually doing that? And they couldn't. But they came after us. And even though we got some of those things waylaid, what ended up happening is every single year in the spring, it was like clockwork. I was one of the first people on the market with lettuces and peas and various crops. We would have another inspector come out in a nice, new, shiny government car, generally a student, and they'd come up and they would seize various samples of all of our stuff, and it would be tested for E. coli, and it would be tested for heavy metals. The same kind of thing does not happen in your grocery stores. It only happened at the farmers markets. Every single year, they were buying from me. And they did pay. I'll give them that. So they confiscated the stuff. You couldn't say no, and they had this. So you got to picture this. You're at a farmer's market. There's people all around, your customers. And you got some government unit come out there. They're in a lab robe. They've got gloves on. They've got goggles on. They got a styrofoam box, and they're taking your tomatoes, and they're taking your lettuce, and they're putting it in Ziploc baggies, and they're putting it inside in front of all of your customers. You look like a biohazard. Really bad for business, or at least potentially. And this is what we had to put up with. This is an old problem. But you know why it's getting attention now? because we don't like the Americans, right? Because it's elbows up, at least on the consumer level. The government doesn't care anymore. We're going to have to make a deal, folks. The Americans are irreplaceable. All we do is suffer without them, needlessly, pointlessly. But that's what Canadians love to do. We've been needlessly suffering under this idea that we can't develop our resources and get rich. Needlessly. Even as the government prints your value, your purchasing power into oblivion, they just don't want you to prosper. But what we should understand out of all this is, first off, it's not new. Second of all, it's only getting attention because we hate the United States. But the third and biggest thing, which isn't really addressed in any of this is just a blanket criticism of grocery stores mislabeling their products, which is dirty. But here's the thing. We can't replace those products. We don't have the domestic production. We outsource. We made this decision, folks. In the 1960s, I got a tweed jacket that my father bought. He used to run a 100-acre farm. They grew tomatoes and they grew various other things, and they sent their crop right to the canneries for preservation so that you could buy that product in the winter months. And so he went to a wholesalers meeting with the supermarket buyers, and they were told, we're not buying from you anymore. You're going to have to go and do something else. Now we're buying from California. Now we're buying from Mexico. See you later. And they were all kicked out, and many of them went broke. We made a conscious decision, and this is an interesting thing that ties in with yesterday's video, because we talk about how dairy is protected, and maple syrup is protected, and there's a honey racket, there's a chicken racket, and there's an egg racket. We have all these different cartels, and that's all they are, and they're sold to us in the name of protectionism. But we gutted all of these other segments of our agricultural independence. And we made ourselves consciously dependent on cheap imports. Now, at the end of the day, all of these situations, whether it's the cartels or whether it's the cheap imports, benefit the people at the top who own everything, the ownership class, the very rich financiers. The whole system in Canada is set up to make sure that their pockets keep getting greased. But to break it back down, CBC is not telling you the history of the decision to make Canada dependent on imports of food. We cannot replace these imports. You can do elbows up and you can do boycotts all day, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up buying almonds from somewhere else and strawberries from somewhere else. And that's just the way it is. So you can get outraged all you want. Canada is a dependent nation, and we're also a deeply delusional nation. Because as people carry on about elbows up and Orange Man bad and we can replace the United States, it is pretend. It's make-believe of the highest order. And your politicians are more than happy for you to keep yourself occupied with nonsense. Well, they go about the business of carving up this country, which is what they've been doing for decades. In the meantime, new ethics code tells nurses to denounce white European medicine again. This is the 2025 Code of Ethics for Nurses. From the Canadian Nurses Association. Once again, it's only white Europeans who are actively discriminated against. If we substituted the word white out for black and European out for African, it would be mass outrage. There's only one form of systemic racism in Canada anymore, and it's the racism against white Europeans. Period. And while Canadians are preoccupied with nonsense, we have headlines like this from Deloitte. Canadian economy headed for recession this year, according to Deloitte Outlook. Canadians should be prepared for really soft economic activity over the next 6 to 8 months. You know, many of these financial institutions are gaslighting us. They're saying that the housing market has stalled. I showed you yesterday how one house is 50% down over the last 3 months because people are trying to sell and get out at any price. And these are the people who were lucky enough to buy in the 1990s. So they're still making 5x on their money. They're probably going to make more money on that house sale if they can get it than they actually made working, which is crazy, which means it has a long way to go, but it hasn't just stalled. The major markets are in a free fall in spite of the fact that we're not building homes and we're cramming people in every single day, but those people ain't buying houses. As I talked about yesterday, another one from the Conference Board of Canada, Canada's economic outlook clouded by uncertainty, and it goes on to talk about trade wars and all this other nonsense. And it's not that it's nonsense. It's that there's this, again, ideology drives everything. And so even your think tanks are afraid to tell the truth and talk about the fact that Canada has been heading into economic uncertainty for a decade plus. We have had record deficits. The combined government debt at the provincial and federal level is $2.8 trillion. We can't maintain this course, and this was long before the Orange Man came back. We were heading towards trouble. Our manufacturing base has been decimated. We have foreign ownership. Our biggest business is the drug trade and money laundering. I've proved it on this channel. I've showed you with government documents. Money laundering drove real estate growth in many regions of this country. And now, because of Donald Trump, the Canadian government is flirting with actually doing something about it. And they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because actually doing something about the rampant criminality in Canada is just one more thing that collapses the price of housing. And so many boomers are planning to retire on the meteoric rise in the price of their property. But don't worry. Canada's got $2,200 direct deposit, hits in October. Will you get this one-time tax-free payment? So this isn't going to cost you anything. It doesn't show up anywhere on your income taxes. It's $2,200 free for seniors, people with disabilities, and low-income residents. The government knows, the Liberal government knows that its base of support is in the 65-plus category, and they will bankrupt the future so that you'll maintain your support and vote for them one more time. There are a lot more monumental things happening in the world, things that will actually shape the future course of the planet, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. There's developments in the United States that have been very interesting, and I want to get into it, but I just felt it necessary to just do another video like this about Canada, about the tedium that is Canada, because there's so much to talk about that's bad. It's almost impossible to find something that's good. And people here are so hypnotized. They're so, and this is what it comes down to. Screen time. The irony of me being on a screen telling you that screen time is the primary problem. Everybody's got their heads down. They're living in a virtual reality. They're looking at that social media. They're looking at TikTok. Their brains are scatterburst all over the place. They think that they pick up their Google News feed on their phones and they're informed, and that's all they got to do. They're distracted. They're working hard to pay the taxes. They're consumed by carefully crafted illusions. So they don't even know what they don't know. And that's what we're up against. Now, the mental prison is not as strong here in Western Canada. There's a lot of eyes up here. People don't have their heads down. People still converse and meet in cafes, and do social things, and have community. Maybe there's something to build there. But our premiers are busy kissing Doug Ford's ass and trying to make a deal with the very people who have done so much to stand in our way. And I just have to ask, when do we try something different?